Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm your host, Janelle Blue. Before we get started, I want to thank the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, who is the sponsor of this program, and also our producer, Sydney Sachs, and his crew for making this show possible. Today, I welcome my host, Chuck Mason. We're going to talk about mapping the neighborhood.
Yes.
And so welcome, Chuck.
Thanks, Janelle. Actually, what I'm going to talk about, I, about 15 years ago, attended a conference up in Philadelphia, and one of the lectures was about using maps. And so I took the idea and I used it, but for more local things. So, we often wonder about our ancestors. Where did they shop? Where did they go to church? Where did they work? And those kinds of things. And so there's a lot of information that you can gain from different types of maps. Not one map is going to give you everything.
Right.
So what I first want to talk about is the collection that we have here in the Washington, D.C. area. The first one is the Library of Congress, and the collection is in the James Madison building down in the basement, and it is the largest map collection in the world.
It is overwhelming.
Yes. Do they have everything? No. But almost anything I have needed a map for, they've been able to come up with something. The National Archives out at College Park has a map collection, and I know people that run out to College Park first, but the maps that are there are strictly ones that were used by different government agencies. So the Library of Congress has maps for all over the world.
Right.
And the one at Archives 2 is kind of limited. Also, the Daughters of the American Revolution has a map collection, and it's a good map collection. Sometimes you find things there that you might not find other places. And don't forget to look at maps in books, because they have a pretty good collection of maps in books. Then if you're trying to find out about the land and what it looked like and things like that, the U.S. Geological Survey out in Reston has the topographic maps, which include things like churches and cemeteries and things like that. And sometimes if you're looking for a church that's disappeared or a cemetery that's now disappeared, finding a map of the time frame that the cemetery was there or the church was there, you may find they have maps that include that information.
That's
the
good.
other thing that's nice about those is if you're building your own map collection, you can get copies of those maps, so you can buy them from them. And of course, local places, our own Virginia Room out in Fairfax City is the genealogy collection, and they have a large collection of maps for kind of Northern Virginia and DC, because parts of DC were actually originally in Virginia. And also the Special Collections Library, the Alexandria Library System down on Queen Street, has a map collection, and it's basically, again, Alexandria, Washington, D.C., but worth taking a look at depending on where your ancestors are. And then there are other places. The Family History Library out in Salt Lake has a collection. Again, you want to do a locality search, and I tell people when you're doing a locality search, make sure you do the state, the county, the city or the township where your ancestors lived, because I have had things pop up in one of the search categories that I thought should have popped up in one of the others, and it didn't.
Oh, like
so there may be one that is city related. And it doesn't pop up doing a search for the city that your ancestors were in. It's at the county level. for whatever reason. So that's true of any records that you're looking for, not just maps.
Yeah.
And then looking at the area where your ancestors lived, going in and looking at the map collection that the state archives may have or the state library may have. And again, they may have things that are duplicates in both places, but again, you might find things that are in one but not in the other.
Well, and in the state, you're probably going to dig down deeper into the little communities
yes.
than it would be at the, say, the
Yes.
National Archives or
Yes.
the,
yes.
yeah.
And of course, the state archives in New Jersey does not concentrate so much on maps like the state library, which is 2 buildings over. So there,
Yeah.
when I go there, it's just a short walk from one to the other. But the state library has the huge collection of maps versus the state archives. And then don't forget the historical and genealogical societies that are in the state. And this may be a statewide society, it may be county, it might even be a city or a town. Mm-hmm. And then the public libraries in the area where your ancestors lived. They are going to also have a map collection that's going to be helpful. So, it just depends on what's in the collection, what you're going to find. You may find lots of duplication. And of course, then also just doing an internet search. Going in, I use Google for the most part, going in and putting in a locality. And oftentimes, I will have, particularly on a site called Pinterest, I'll have lots of map collections.
Oh, yes,
come
there
up
are.
on
Absolutely. And also, because counties change so much.
Yes.
I mean, I'm thinking right now that when I go to the North Carolina archives, the first thing they do is to give you this sheet that shows how the counties have changed over time.
Yeah.
Critical information.
Yeah, that's very, very important. And I have a classic example of that. Originally, Gloucester County, New Jersey was one of the 4 original counties. And it was from the Delaware River on the west all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And my 3rd great-grandparents bought land in Hamilton Township in Gloucester County. Well, in 1837, they basically drew a line down the middle of the county and it split. Mm-hmm. Hamilton Township was then in Atlantic County. It wasn't in Gloucester anymore. So whenever I go looking for records for them prior to 1837, I have to look in Gloucester County.
Yeah.
After that, I have to look in Atlantic County.
Yeah.
And people don't always think of that, but it's important that you do that. And it's the same with looking at the maps, not just the records, but the maps. The maps are going to be different. You're going to get more details and things.
A good example, if you're doing local research, is Alexandria City versus the other counties around here and how they all divided out. It's very useful to know.
Philadelphia is another one. Originally, you had the city of Philadelphia and you had the county. And now they're one and the same. You no longer really have a county of Philadelphia. It's all the city.
Whereas in Alexandria, that city is standalone. And then there's Fairfax County and Arlington County all around.
And of course, you have Fairfax City versus Fairfax County.
That's true too. So, yeah.
So then I want to talk about different types of maps. And we actually have some examples here, if they put the first one up. It's historical maps. These are maps that are, have the details of the time frame and everything. And this is one of New Jersey, and what I have of the little red arrow there is actually the dividing line that was finally settled between New York and New Jersey because there was a feud or a difference of opinion over where the line actually divided. And a lot of these can be found in various places, and in some cases there are companies that have actually done reproductions of the map. So if you want a copy of it, you can buy a reproduction. A great example of that was there was a company that did historic maps for Scotland and also for Ireland, and relatively inexpensive set for both of those, because I happened to be going to a conference, and the librarian of the Virginia room actually said to me, "Will you get these for me at the conference?" And so I did, and I forget, I think it was only about $20 or $25 for this whole big set of maps. The next one that is helpful is plat and land ownership maps, and we have an example of that. Again, these are maps that are going to lay out who owned the land, and there's various types. This is out in the Midwest, where we have the blocks of land dividing things up, and so you have the little blocks there with who owned that land.
Now, is that the original plat owner, the original grantee, or is that?
I don't know for sure on all of them. It kind of depends on the time frame of the maps, because in some cases they published different series, like every 5 or 10 years.
I see. So it would be whoever's there at the time. Yeah. In Texas, those maps always started with the original grant owner.
I don't have anybody who lived out there in that part of the country, and so the map that I have is one from a friend of mine who happened to have it. But other things that I have seen is just little drawings where they will draw the streets in an area, particularly rural areas, and then they will put the landowner, so they'll put a little dot and whose house or whose land
that
was
would be handy.
next to each other. So that makes it interesting. And then the third type is the topographic maps that I talked about that U.S. Geological Survey has, and we have an example of that. And these were done time periods. So, I don't know, they go back at least into the 1800s, but, again, it shows a section of the area. And like I mentioned, you can find old cemeteries and churches and other things on there, but it also gives you the elevation levels and what the land was like. So this one is for a nice green area, but some of the ones out west, you're going to have more brown, where you have desert area and not the vegetation. So.
Does it have the topograph? Do those have like railroads on there?
Yes.
And so
In
that's
some cases,
very
yes,
handy
they
to
will,
know where the railroads
They will show
were.
those kinds of things. And of course, they're also helpful where you have in the description of a piece of land, like rivers and lakes and things like that, which may have expanded or may have shrunk.
Right.
And so that also helps to get one of the time frame that your ancestors are there. And then another type of map is street and road maps. And again, we have an example of this, and this is one in Woodbury, New Jersey, where they renamed some of the streets, and actually at one point they renumbered the streets. And I was working on a project about a family that lived there, and I could not find the street that they lived on a map till I actually found this in their collection. And the name had been changed, and they also decided to evenly number the streets. So sometimes you had odd numbers on one side of the street and the next street would have it on the other side. So they made it uniform. And so that map was quite helpful. And then another type of map that can be quite helpful is transportation maps. Now this is one that shows the whole eastern seaboard. You will sometimes find more than one type of transportation on the map. So you may find railroads, you may find roads, you may find going back trails before we had roads and things like that. So these can be very helpful. Some of the city ones, like one of the ones that I found for Philadelphia, which was a little helpful with the problem that I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes, it gave me the trolley lines. It gave me the streets.
Wow.
There were buses, but there weren't a whole lot of buses at the time. It was more the trains coming into the city and the trolleys, but that was quite helpful.
And that's really useful if you're trying to figure out how did your ancestor get to where they wound up from the port of New Orleans or from the port of Baltimore. Did they take it? Were there rails at that time, or
Yep.
how did they do that? So those maps can help
they
that.
Get there. And the next type of map that we're going to show is military maps. These are maps that will show different things. In this particular case, I got this from the Library of Congress. One of my second great-grandmother's first husbands was killed in a battle of Gaines Mill down near Richmond in the Civil War. And I actually was on a tour down there, and after we were done touring the map and geography room, they asked, does anybody have a map they want to see? Well, I had been trying to find information about this battle, and it was not very easily available. And so I asked, I had a man who was a real Civil War buff. He came out with a paragraph about that big in a book. It was all he could find on the battle. But I asked, and they said, oh yeah, well, they brought this great big folder which fit on two 30-inch by 6-foot tables.
Goodness.
And opened it up, and there were a whole series of maps of the battle. It was a 3.5-day battle, so it gave all where everybody was the morning of the first day and then the afternoon, and then there were some other miscellaneous maps, and then he took them back and copied them all for me. And
that's great.
I only needed the one for the first morning because the guy I was looking for was killed that very first morning in the battle. But these are great maps for particularly understanding some of the things that were going on.
And I had never thought about the fact that when they're having these military campaigns, the leaders have got to have these almost daily maps to show
to know
where everybody
where
is.
things
So
are. And the next one we're going to show an example of is fire insurance maps. Now, people are familiar with the Sanborn fire insurance maps. They were the biggest company that produced these maps. If we could have the example, please. But there were other insurance companies that did take and produce maps. Yes. And so, these show you the streets. They show you the buildings that are in the town. They show you what they're made of, whether they're 1-story, 2-story. They even show things like outbuildings. And in one case out in Pittsburgh, I saw some, they even showed where the outhouses were in the back of the buildings. So they are very important, and I'm going to talk about those here in a minute. And the last type of map is a cemetery map. And we have an example of those. Now, this is an overlay of the cemetery with all the different sections. Some of the larger cemeteries will actually take a section and blow it up and show where the graves are. And I didn't bother to bring that particular map. So then we need to put this all together. So what we're going to do is we're going to select a family that we want to research. And I've got a sample of what I put together. This is a table in Word. And what I did was I looked at my grandfather's family. So it's my great-grandparents that came over from Glasgow, Scotland to Philadelphia. My great-grandfather's 3 sisters and 2 half-sisters, and his stepfather and his mother, and then all of his children,
Wow.
and then all of their spouses.
That's a big group.
And so I put together this chart, and I used the date of things that I found, the location where they were living, who it was in the family that I found, and then remarks about it. For example, on the first one, I'm talking about Lee Street, where my great-grandparents first lived when they first came to Philadelphia. Well, later, they moved from there, but my great-grandfather's sisters, who came over later, lived on Lee Street also. So you want to look at the whole family for this. And then when you've got that information, if we could put the next slide up, you want to take a map of the area as close to the time frame that you're looking at. So I was basically looking at 1900 to 1910 when I started working on this. So what I did was I took a map and I marked all of the streets where the family lived, and I took a marker and I marked in different colors the streets where the different families lived. So that gave me an idea of where the different family members lived. This one in particular is the 4 places that my great-grandparents, the original immigrants, lived before they eventually retired and moved down to Somers Point, New Jersey. And then you're going to also take the information that you find in the records, and you're going to create the next chart that we have here. And this is a list of people's occupations. And so again, I included the name of the person, the year I found the information for, the type of record, and what the occupation was. And so then I used that information and I went into a variety of sources. I searched city directories. I searched Yellow Pages in telephone directories. I used the fire insurance maps and other maps to determine where things were close to them. And so I looked for things like schools, churches, places of employment. My ancestors worked in a lot of hosiery mills and other weaving industries. So I looked for those factories. I looked for the stores that were in the area, recreational facilities. They belonged to some fraternal organizations. So I went through and looked at all of those kinds of things. And for example, Agnes, who was one of my great-grandfather's sisters who lived on Lee Street, worked in a carpet mill. Well, I found there was only one carpet mill in Philadelphia.
Okay.
So I pretty much know where she worked.
Yeah.
The hosiery mills, and I didn't bring an example of all these things, but the hosiery mills where my grandfather and my grandmother worked when they were through school and all, there were 3 in the area where the family lived. So I don't know for sure which one from the maps, but I do have an idea of places, and so far I haven't been able to find any business records for any of them. I think they're probably long gone. And of course I got into genealogy after my grandparents were all gone, like 20 years later, so I can't ask them where were they or where did they work. But in looking at it, and I used the Sanborn fire maps mainly for this, again, down at the Library of Congress. But, I found that there were 7 schools within the neighborhoods where they lived, 3 Presbyterian churches. The family was Presbyterian in Scotland. My grandfather's generation, really only one of the children, his oldest brother, stayed with the Presbyterian church, but there were 7 hosiery mills. There were other clothing mills. There were mills that were not identified as to what type of mill it was. There were 3 theaters in the area, so they had access to going to the theater. Again, stores were not necessarily identified, so I found 10 stores that were close on the maps. 2 parks, a library, 2 cemeteries, and 3 taverns and pubs, and a police station, and like I say, the carpet mill. So, I've got some basic information. Then I have to go digging deeper to find out which of these places might they have taken and done things at.
And if you're trying to write about the lives of your family, wow, this paints this neighborhood paints a picture, doesn't it? And if they all live in a general area, you can also imagine that there were lots of family gatherings and lots of interaction within the family.
And they did really, kind of all live in a neighborhood, kind of the northeast section of Philadelphia. And, this is true of many large cities where people of a certain ancestry will kind of live in that neighborhood. My grandfather's oldest brother stayed in that neighborhood the rest of his life. The rest of them did move out, married, and moved out various times. So.
Well, Chuck, this is really very interesting and an interesting approach to doing genealogical research, isn't it? And so thank you very much for the presentation today. I also want to invite our listeners to join our Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, mvgenealogy.org. Look us up. We've got lots of interesting things, and we would love to have you join us. So thank you. Thank you, Chuck.
You're welcome.